Good morning. A warm welcome to the Humanist community in Silicon Valley Sunday Forum for those joining us this morning. My name is Ray Sunby, President of the Humanist community. The Humanist community is a chapter of the American Humanist Association. Humanism is a secular and reality-based philosophy of life that affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good. We value freedom, health, happiness, fairness, compassion, and using science and reason to acquire and apply knowledge. If these words describe your thinking, we invite you to become a member of the Humanist community if you have not yet done so. A special welcome to those who are with us for the first time. We invite you to continue listening to our weekly forums and other events. Please aid us in continuing to present these forums by donating to the Humanist community. Membership forms, a list of upcoming events, and information about donating to the Humanist community and other information can be found on our website.
The Humanist Chaplain Benjamin Iten will be presenting a talk on Everyday Humanism, the idea that humanism is a philosophy of life and so can help inform how we live our lives. Ben's a Humanist Chaplain, certified educator with the Association of Clinical Pastoral Education. And as a pastoral educator and chaplain, his work focuses on applying humanism to everyday living, helping others create meaning from a meaningless world, and working with humanists in an interfaith setting.
All right, lovely. Ben. Thanks, Alex. In my pedagogical need of things, I believe in transparency. And this is very much a topic that I think of as still being in workshop status. Kind of how I envision these talks is usually I kind of present where my current thinking is, how I am processing some of this stuff, informed greatly from my work as a chaplain and chaplain educator. And then leave it open to the dialogue and conversation of the group and the curiosity and feedback, both friendly and challenging to the ideas that I present. And hopefully we can all learn together from that process. But there are some foundational ideas that I will set out for everybody, and we can agree or disagree on them later. But yes, as Alex mentioned, the idea behind everyday humanism is that, as is in the Humanist Manifesto, this idea that humanism is a philosophy of life. And so when we're talking about a philosophy of life, we are talking about a philosophical way of being that influences how we live our lives every day. I think that when it comes to humanism, and we're talking about humanism as a philosophy of life, I think this is something that we as a movement are still very much growing into. I think historically we have spent a lot of our energy in defining ourselves against other folks in a sense of what might be our atheism or agnosticism or general skepticism about the supernatural. But I think we are trending as a movement now away from those boundary defining propositions of things into more of a practical application of humanism. And so a part of why I can think of this as a workshop kind of conversation is because I think that we are at the sort of leading edge of humanism when we're starting to talk about everyday humanism. And so I think as many humanists as there are likely that many different applications of humanism into our everyday lives. Some of it may be more intentional than others, but I can imagine it's all kind of there in one form or another. Some of the ways that we have tried to live into this so far as a movement are from some wonderful books. I've got many of them from my bookshelf. Good Without God by Greg Epstein. He's the Humanist Chaplain, I think the lead chaplain now, or head chaplain at Harvard University. Our former director, Roy Speckhart of the American Humanist Association, wrote Creating Change Through Humanism. Another fine book. I think my struggle with those two books in particular is that they still read very apologetic to me. That is, they're still kind of talking language, trying to defend humanism to those who are outside of humanism. Maybe 3/4 of it is in this more apologetic defensive stance, and then maybe 1/4 of the book might be in a more like written to humanists or to skeptics about living everyday humanism. I think we really start getting into the nuts and bolts of this sort of thing when we start reading some books by Anthony Penn. The End of God Talk, an African American humanist theology, which is a fun title in and of itself. He's if you're not familiar with him, he is the professor of religious studies at Rice University, African American. He's been to many of, he's on one of the AHA's speaker bureau folks. His other book, When Color Blindness Isn't the Answer, Humanism and the Challenge of Race, I think also kind of brings us into this conversation, both of sort of macro ethics, which I think is where humanism kind of sits naturally, and a little bit of the micro ethics. Again, that gets us to that everyday life of things. And if you are ever interested in having a conversation about race and humanism and the complications that come through that, Anthony Penn's book, When Color Blindness Isn't the Answer, it's a fantastic facilitator for those conversations. But all of that to say that these are still pretty good books, but they're kind of progressing us closer and closer to the conversations that we are still as a movement starting to have of living humanism, using humanism as our philosophical framework for our lives every day. I think most recently, if you Google the 10 Commitments from the Humanist Association, American Humanist Association, you might find the most recent like manifestation of this. And they are sort of our secular version of the 10 Commandments. You know, we're not commanding anything, we're committing to a way of life and certain aspects of the way of life, like altruism and ethics and empathy and peace and justice. We're getting closer and closer to this idea that humanism can, for those of us who want to call ourselves humanists, provide some boundaries to how we might live our lives, some direction to how we might live our lives. I think in the past, in my sort of anecdotal experience anyway, what has often happened is that humanism has either become the euphemism for atheism, and someone might say I'm humanist, and sort of a way to not say I'm atheist. And then they might actually inform their everyday living with another philosophy. So in some ways, humanism is sort of the framework, the bones of how someone might identify and live their lives, but really maybe ethical utilitarianism or stoicism or existentialism or nihilism or hedonism might actually be some of the more foundational things that might be the way they live their lives. And for me, historically, that has been, quite frankly, existentialism and nihilism, the positive sides of those things. When I'm talking about making meaning from a meaningless life, I'm using language that comes from sort of the positive sides of nihilism, absurdism, existentialism. But I am myself trying to move away from grounding myself in that language and trying to really be like, what would it be like to just brazenly be humanist and let humanism inform me? I think if we look at the Humanist Manifesto, we can see that humanism and in that manifestation is in fact built upon a lot of these other philosophies. We can see stoicism in there when the manifesto says this life is all and enough, sort of acceptance of the reality of the world and the way things are, and that we cannot really change that all that much. That's kind of a stoic philosophy. If we look at the sort of, we'll get to this a little bit later on, the end goal of humanism as sort of the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. We're talking about utilitarianism in a sense, and maximizing happiness and maximizing good, the greater good, the greatest good for the greatest amount of people. When we're talking in the definition, I think about being able and responsible to live moral and ethical lives, this idea of some level of freedom, if there's some level of ability, we can debate how free humanity is, whether or not humanity really is free. But we're starting to use some of the existentialist languages there as well. And so we do sort of see all of these philosophical movements influence humanism, become found in different parts of the Humanist Manifesto. But I do think there is, in this amalgamation of things, something that is uniquely humanism. And I think when we start talking about this, we are in some sense defining boundaries, but we're defining very practical boundaries, very influential boundaries. We're moving away from identity boundaries and into sort of living boundaries. I feel the need to step back a little bit and address sort of two main assumptions that I'm making here. I'm making an argument that one, the question, can humanism provide some direction to our everyday life? I make the argument, yes, we can. I think that when we are looking at some of the, for lack of a better terms, culture war, the fact that humanism has historically, and various secular identities have historically been a little shy in providing direction to folks as they are deconstructing from atheism or a traditional religion, I think has ceded some ground to more theistic frames of references that I don't think we necessarily need to give ground to. And then we ultimately ask ourselves, and why are we around for if we have nothing really positive to offer the world? And when I'm being quite frank and honest, I am really bored with conversations about whether or not God exists. Those are arguments that I just hate having. Not because I doubt my side, but because I'm so sure about my side. You're not going to convince me. More often than not, I'm an atheist. More often than not, the theist is so sure on their side, I'm not going to convince them. All we're doing is providing arguments to shore up our own way of being, in a sense. That doesn't really do anything to further our understanding of each other. What is actually, for me, more challenging to theism than atheism is, in fact, humanism. Because humanism, when I live a moral and ethical life, when I live a life full of empathy and compassion for my fellow human being, without any fear of God, without any fear of repercussions about heaven or hell or anything like that, that is in fact a more challenging and assertive position against theism than whether or not God exists. When we look at biases against people, it is not the logical argument that deconstructs bias, it is actually relationship that deconstructs bias. It's hard for somebody to send someone to hell if they really like them. It makes that theology a little more complicated. On the flip side, it's hard to demonize an evangelical if I get to know them, if I get to like them. They become less of the boogeyman and more of the person that they are. In both ways, these relationships dismantle biases, and I think humanism as a way of life actually is more assertive and more challenging to theism than claiming an atheist identity. But I digress. But I think because of that, I think it is incumbent upon humanism to then say, we offer something different, and here's what it is. And it is not whether or not God exists. It is about how we live our lives, which gets to the second assumption that I'm making here, is that should we even do this? Who do we think we are to have the gall to tell people how they might live? Doesn't this smack of religion? Are we just, substituting somebody's religion for our own? To which I say, we may very well be, but if we don't, who is? When people deconstruct their traditions and their religions, what do we, if we don't offer them something to land on, they're going to land on something else. Essentially, we offer them a binary of landing in some sort of theism, which may not necessarily be best for them, or a world of negation, where the constant definition is, I don't know what I am, but I'm not that, I'm not that, I'm not that. Or that can feel like an offer of sort of anarchic freedom, because there's no boundaries. When you're moving, deconstructing from a religious tradition that has very clear boundaries, and you're moving into a tradition, which I think humanism naturally has, a very porous boundaries of things, it can feel it can feel quite disorienting, and like anarchy, ethical anarchy maybe, and that can be scary, and people may pull themselves back into the traditions that they know, because that's more comfortable, even if they feel more tension with that space. And there have been studies that show that in the middle of crises, people who are on the margins of their faith tradition, those people who might, if humanism offered a way of life more tangibly, might transition into a more humanist identity and a more humanist way of living. But people who live on the boundaries of their tradition, when it comes time for crises, they actually move themselves back towards the more traditional aspects of the religion they were raised in. So a spiritual but not religious person who may be more ambiguous theologically, but was raised evangelical, when they are facing a crisis in their lives, serious illness, death of a loved one, their own impending death, they will tend to, according to the research, pull back into that spirituality of their upbringing, the evangelicalism they were raised in. The studies have showed on the other end of things, the more staunchly atheist one is, the less that happens. Practically, that doesn't happen. And when we look at emotional and spiritual distress in the midst of crises, the more solid one is in their tradition, whether that is some form of religion, Christianity, traditional religion, let's say Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and the more staunch atheists, these actually have pretty good emotional and religious and spiritual outcomes when facing crisis. It is this middle ground where people really get into emotional distress in the midst of crises, according to the research. So if humanism seeds this meaning-making language, this way of living, this way of creating a foundation to the theism, when people get into those points of crisis, they're going to pull them way back into that space of things. Whereas I think if we are assertively humanist and we say, no, come to us, we have a way of life, we have a way of being, we have a way of finding meaning in this meaningless world, it's okay. I think that we can help people find a way to make it through these points of crises without necessarily reverting to something that I might think of as unhealthy. They might have initially thought of as unhealthy. That might have been a part of their deconstructing to a more ambiguous spirituality. So I think it is incumbent upon us we should be doing this. If we don't, we're actually falling short of our fellow human beings, in my humble opinion. But where are we going? So the Humanist Manifesto, the most recent one, has in its sort of final bolded paragraph this idea that working to benefit society maximizes individual happiness. And that we want to work to free humanity from the brutalities of mere survival. We want to reduce suffering. We want to improve society, develop a global community. We want to minimize the inequities of circumstance and ability. We want the just distribution of nature's resources and the fruits of human effort so that as many as possible can enjoy a good life. Again, here's the influence of some of that utilitarianism piece of things. But we are saying that from a humanist perspective, we want as many people as possible, greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. How do we, that's where I think when we're talking about humanism, what is the goal of humanism? I do think there is this sort of utilitarian influence of this idea that can't we all just get along? And how can we seek thriving for everybody as equally as possible? I would argue for equally. That's where we're targeted towards. So how do we go about doing that? I think is this foundational idea that life is humanity is here. We're humanism, so we're going to talk about humanity. Humanity is here, the result of unguided evolution. However many billions of years ago, the universe started. Earth formed for some billion years ago, if I remember my science right. Forgive me, I'm a theologian, not a scientist. And then life has evolved. But 200,000 years ago or so, humanity has come onto the scene in one form or another. And we've continued to evolve. And there's been no guidance to that. This is there's been no guiding supernatural force. It's just kind of happened. It's just kind of the way it is. We've arrived to this moment now, 2:30 on the East Coast, 11:30 on the West Coast of the United States of America in the 21st century. The 15, 20 of us or so hanging out via Zoom. In the end, the result of pure chance. No guiding principle, no reason or meaning for that is inherent to this experience that brought all of us here together. Life, as an unguided evolutionary creature, is inherently meaningless. This is fantastic. This means that we get to construct meaning however the heck we want. That means each experience, we are all free to construct the meaning that we need or want from that experience at that given moment. And in a very postmodern, highly subjective way, we're all right. And because that's what I need from that moment. Now, humanism provides a little bit of boundaries to that meaning-making process. Humanism says, well, if we look at the way humanity has evolved, if we look at the way that as life has evolved on the planet, we can kind of talk about various things. We can talk about creatures evolving as social creatures or as non-social creatures, individual creatures. We see in the insects world, we can see social insects, bees. They work cooperatively. They all have a goal in mind, and they are going about their business to create their society. They're social creatures. In the same way, humans have evolved to be social creatures. We have evolved to create families that depend upon each other, that has created tribes that depend upon each other, cities, nations, religions. If we look globally, we can see that humanity is, in one sense, kind of a global community. It is we make our meaning. We are social creatures, and so we make our meaning from our relationships with others and ourselves. And this then is eminently practical because this is the only life we get. This becomes eminently practical when we start talking about ethics. How then should we live? And the definition of humanism is that we are, in fact, a progressive philosophy of life, not meaning that we are politically progressive, although we tend to be politically progressive, but that we understand that where we are now is not necessarily where we are going to be, nor is it where we have been. We progress. And I would argue that in our ethics, when we're talking about our progression of ethics, that what drives our progress is, in fact, empathy. And that the more we live into our empathy, the more we progress. In some sense, I'm going to say this is actually the opposite of the golden rule of Christianity. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Or, I'm not sure if our Jewish friend is here, if we're looking from a rabbinic perspective, that which is hateful to you, do not do unto other people. Or there's many different ways that this golden rule gets manifested in various different religious traditions throughout the world. The problem with that is that it's not empathic. It is very narcissistic. Do unto others as I would have them do unto me. The center of the ethical decision-making process there is still me. It is still imperialistic. I am imposing upon you how I want to be treated. An empathic response is what is often referred to as the platinum rule. Do unto others as they would have you do unto them. That requires slowing down. That requires empathy. That requires listening and listening to the other person, questions. It requires that relationship. It requires us making meaning out of our relationships with other folk. We cannot be empathic and cut off from other people. But the Humanist Manifesto, but humanism also argues that we are, in fact, our own individual. Our goal in the end is individual happiness. We do not lose ourselves to the needs necessarily of the other. If we're using existentialist philosophy, I am both subject and object at the same time. I am an ambiguous person. I am the main character of my own story, and I am the side character, the bit character, the extra in somebody else's story. Both are happening at the same time. And so here I think we start to find some of the other balance of our ethical structures of system. What can I give to that person in order to meet their needs of happiness? In a very sort of bald example of this, if someone is finds a meaningful relationship from bondage and humiliation, am I someone that is willing to be in a dominant position in order to provide them that meaningful relationship? if I'm not, if that's not me, and honestly, that is not me, but if that is not me and somebody is coming to me and I want to do unto them as that which is meaningful to them, I could say, I appreciate what you need. I am not that person to give that to you. That is not moralizing their decision, what they need. That is not saying to them that what they need is inherently wrong or bad or naive or unethical. It is merely saying, it is setting up the boundary that what you need, I cannot give you. Now, my chaplain side wants to say, so now let's find somebody who can give that to you. And facilitate that conversation and that side of things. I think when we're talking about empathy, this also leads us not only to these micro ethical questions of treating others as they would have us treat them, what is meaningful to them, but also justice issues of we start listening to those who are oppressed. We start listening to them with empathy. We are faced then with our own shortcomings, limitations, ways that we are involved in systems that minimize people's freedom, that minimizes people's happiness. And we move away then from this greater good, and we are forced to reconcile with that and change, progress. If we stay the same, we have not lived into the humanist idea that we are a progressive philosophy of life. We are an evolving, ever-changing, ever-moving philosophy of life. We're on our third Humanist Manifesto. If we follow the regular cycle of things in 20 years, we will be on our fourth Humanist Manifesto. That's well and good when you are a progressive philosophy of life. But that change again comes from listening to individuals and listening to groups that are saying, ouch, we hurt. And going, what can we do to alleviate or eliminate that hurt? This is also very important and when we look around us, in the sense that that we are here, the result of unguided evolution. There is no afterlife. This life is all we got. I think the manifesto gets it wrong when it says that this life is all we got and it is enough. That second phrase, and it is enough, is easy for me to say as an upper middle class white man living in my heated house in the middle of Columbus, Ohio. Yes, I had to dig my 3 cars out of the snow yesterday, but I have 3 cars. I know where my food is coming. It's another thing for me to say that this life is all and enough to the person sitting in the cold, holding a sign, who doesn't necessarily know where his next meal is coming from, and say to him, this life is all and enough. This life is all that I got. This life is all that he's got. If I don't do something to change that, am I living a humanist empathic life? I would argue I'm not. Now we can argue, how do we go about that? What systems do we need to change? How do we change those systems in order to do that? That's a conversation for another time. But I think we can do that. If we're looking at an everyday thing, I look at it as a balance of both the here and now, the fact that this guy is cold and hungry right now. And I'm using male language because I have an actual guy in mind that I drive by every day I go to the store. I can give him a couple bucks now. I can buy him some food now to help him satisfy his needs. That's the here and now thing. And it's a long-term thing. I also need to change the systems that are creating that space where that guy is at. If all I do is focus on the systems, I still leave him cold and suffering right now. If all I do is feed him and make him a little less cold and a little less suffering now, I haven't changed the system that will help him get out of that. That might change it for the next generation after him. It is this both and, this ambiguity of things at the same time. And this idea then of these larger systems gets to this idea that that studies show when we're looking at what is effective in religion, when we're looking at what is used positive religious coping in the sort of the chaplaincy research realm of things, the spiritual well-being research realms of things, we're looking at how people make meaning. So for humanism, that's through relationships and empathy. The community, I'm talking to the Humanist Society of the Silicon Valley, right? So we are starting to create communities and places where we gather, where we may agree or disagree or have conversations. People who may notice when somebody's not showing up and reach out to them, just check in, make sure that everything's okay. There's also this idea of the transcendent. Religion calls that transcendent God. If we dissect that into that which is bigger than us, I might argue that the humanist transcendent is in fact the universe, the eons, the epochs of time. This gets back to sort of the blip, the meaninglessness of life. My now 45 and a half years of life on this earth is a blip. When we look at the cosmic times of things, the universe has been here billions of years before my time, before humanity in general. Humanity will inevitably, 94% of all species have gone extinct. Humanity will more than likely go extinct. And billions of years after that, the universe will progress. There's few things more transcendent in my mind than that. And the question then comes, how do we plug into that? And I think we come into justice, we come into the idea of recognizing that as evolved creatures, we are part of a biosphere. We have an impact on that biosphere, both now and long term. How do we plug into that transcendence? We care for the planet. We care for the biosphere that we are lucky enough to be on so that we have the least amount of damage. And then so when we're talking then about, so these are the big things: meaning making, community, that which is bigger than ourselves. And I think humanism, as humanism, can offer those things to humanity. Meaning making through relationships, through empathy, as it informs our progressing ethics. Community, through the relationships and the communities we build together. I would argue for diverse, intervalued communities. And that connecting into that which is bigger than ourselves. It is not the divine, it is the transcendence of time and space. And that's a pretty awesome thing. That's kind of where I'm at now. I'm open to questions, concerns, comments, both positive and challenging.
Yeah, let me just comment. I've always had, can you hear me, by the way?
Yep.
Okay, I've always had a problem with the phrase something bigger than yourself.
Yeah.
It sounds kind of meaningless. It's like higher, people talk about a higher power. I don't know what they mean. You mean something I'm committed to? That's more important than my own life? Fine, say so. you could put it in clearer words, you know. And
Mhm.
I like to think that there are things that I would risk my life for, but I really don't want to know.
Yeah, that which is bigger than yourself uh, is an enigmatic mouthful, because we don't want to use the word transcendence, quite frankly, Alex. It smacks of religion and spirituality. And I, uh, again, I see this some, I'm aware I'm using some battle language, which I have some tension with, but I don't think that's ground we should cede. I don't think it's ground that I don't see it as code switching. I see it as a secular takeover. To redefine these terms. I think these languages like spirituality, enigmatic. What the hell does that mean? Who knows? You read spiritual research. Each article defines spirituality something different. The transcendent. What does that mean? Who knows? In this day and age, these terms have become so ambiguous. Somebody might as well define it. Why not us? But I do think when we're talking about that which is bigger than ourselves, we're talking about those things which transcend my experience right now, my knowledge, my comprehension right now. Science does as well. We acknowledge and the science acknowledges the boundaries of our knowledge. We don't stop there. We don't say, oh, the rest is mystery and God. We go, oh, there's the boundaries of our knowledge. I wonder what's after that. And I think that is a way of engaging in the secular transcendent. I don't think it's something we need to cede to the theists. I think Chip had his hand up. Do I call on people's hands or just somebody else?
Well, I'll call on.
Okay.
I'll take that responsibility. Yeah, Chip.
I've been an atheist for so long.
Bless your heart.
And we keep using the word God. And I never really did have a grip on the concept. And it's gotten less progressively. When people use the word God, I have no idea what they mean.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that once you accept that, even if you do have a God you believe in, you still don't know what anyone else means when they say God.
Mm-hmm.
We use the same word for a purely individual concept, the God between my own ears. These gods are contagious. People pass them along. The God between my ears is also mutable and under the control of the personality between the ears. I consider a God and a personality to have a somewhat equal existence. They are operated by the brain resources, but a personality is a clearly individual thing. And I would like to suggest that the God between each of our ears is a purely individual thing. And as I said, mutable, under our control. And yet we still keep using the one word. I've been an atheist too long. I have lost control on what can fit the definition of a God. In the last 15 years, I have come to call my God the KT comet that wiped out the dinosaurs. It's real.
Yeah.
Every mammal on Earth can say thank you. And it doesn't seem to have any moral input other than dinosaurs bad.
I don't think it even has that moral input.
So as a functional God, I've been an atheist too long. Am I broken? Is that something other people can consider?
I think you make valid points. I think there is the research does tend to show that there are some consistent understandings of God depending on a person's framework. For example, there's been a lot of celebration of the spiritual but not religious, the nuns who have departed from the church of their origin. But when we ask them what they believe, their theology is actually pretty conservative Christian.
What they were raised.
And there tends to be some agreement on that piece of things. I think if you get down to the nitty gritty, I think your point is probably spot on. Like there is going to be some nuanced difference between the God in, I work in the hospital, in room 3317 versus the God, the person in room 3318. I think if we, I think if we get to the point where we can celebrate those differences, well and good. I think that we have the tendency to vilify and demonize the other person's spirituality.
Yeah.
And that's where I think is the crux of the thing. That's why I get bored with arguing about whether or not God exists, because in the end just comes down to demonizing one person and the other.
And
Whereas
that's why I'm so delighted in the fact that my God has scientific papers about it.
Yeah.
And appears on every continent.
Yeah. Nobody has presented the comet as a God. I'm intrigued by that idea. It's certainly as ambivalent and uninvolved as any God I've run into.
It feels good. It originally came because the question was presented when I visited a church with my aunt. She says, "Thank you for walking me to church because you didn't have a reason to be in the room."
Mm-hmm.
And so I went on a search, and you can find a God. There may be others, but it's a completely real God.
And for me, the uniqueness of humanism really is that it can sidestep that question of the divine and say, who is my fellow human being? And how do I treat them?
As always, the teachers of hatred.
And the teachers of love and compassion.
Lately, we have been inundated with people having great success by teaching hatred.
Yes. And it is easy to get lost in those voices and not recognize those voices that have taught us love and compassion. And for me, I think this is not the teaching of humanism per se, but just the teaching of me, is that we're living into that ambiguity of humanity is a messy creature, neither good nor bad. If all we do is celebrate the good of humanity, we're not getting all of humanity. If all we do is bemoan the evils of humanity, we're not getting all of humanity.
Maybe it's the computer scientist in me, but as soon as I accept that it's a very big database, but finite.
Yeah.
So in my mind, it is clear that we have, almost 8 billion current implementations of the code.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone believes something different.
Mm-hmm. And the studies do show that you can point to some patterns in the midst of that difference. And those patterns are what people seem to really hang their hat on more than the differences.
Alex, you're muted.
Oded, you had something to say.
Yeah, I have to some about the Humanist Manifesto.
Yeah.
There is the freedom we have the Taliban. They have the freedom to don't let women to go to work, stay at home, and whatever they want to do. This is a freedom. We have more than few 100 million Muslims that their gods say that they have to make everyone else Muslim. There are much big majority from the elite people in California and United States, which are atheists. They are much more bigger and they're active and the military organized and they have nuclear weapons or developing. And they say, okay, our God is your God and you don't have to quiet it. We decide if you don't quiet it, they will cut your head. This happened. It's not imaginary. So this one thing. Second, if you look for the average income of all the people in the world and you want to seek for equality, can you live on $1,000 or less a year in America? Or just anywhere? Probably not. So how you get equality? That means it's nice to put it on the paper, because the paper can accept everything, but not reality. We are a long way to make that. I mean, everyone have the freedom today to have as many children as they want, no matter what are the resources. We still have concern about global warming. We still have concern about keeping nature and all the other stuff. But we can get it all. That means if the budget is so much, we can get so much.
So
And
let me, I'm sorry, I to cut you off there, Oded. Let me address a couple of things. I'm feeling compelled on a couple things. To your, I'm honestly not sure exactly your points on things, but to your first point, the evils of Islam, it would be inconsistent of me to not point out the millions and millions of Muslims who are actually fine with people who are not Islam and or do not seek to convert me by cutting off my head. In the same way that I seek to complicate my own experience of the entirety of humanity, I must complicate my understanding of those who are Muslim. I have two students of mine who are imams, lovely, lovely gentlemen who are learning from an atheist humanist, who are providing care to Christians and Muslims. And in my experience, they're not really the exceptions. The Humanist Manifesto does argue that humane values are not the monopoly of humanism. Humane values can be found in other traditions, and I think that does include Islam and Christianity and Judaism and Buddhism and all of the individual isms. If we take Chip's point earlier, there is some humane value in all of those things. To the second point, because something is hard to achieve and not yet a reality does not mean it is not worth the struggle. It does not mean that it is not worth the sacrifice that some of us may have to make in order to achieve that end goal. You make a valid point that we must take into consideration purchase price parity. $1,000 in Nigeria does not go the same way as $1,000 in Columbus, Ohio. Heck, $1,000 in Columbus, Ohio doesn't go nearly as far as it does in the Bay Area, from my understanding of things. That does not mean the struggle is not worth it. That does not negate the end goal of equality for all people. In fact, in some ways, it energizes me to work all the harder. It energizes me to tell more people about my visions of things because, again, I'm not going to live beyond this realm of things, but maybe I might impact a 20-year-old who impacts a 20, when they're 50 years old, they might impact a 20-year-old underneath them. And the struggle may go on for generations until perhaps, hopefully, we may achieve some equality or at least some betterness than where we are now. In the end, I'm only responsible for what I do and how I live my life now, and the way that I let that impact myself and other folks. Sorry to cut you off there, Oded. Maybe we should go on to somebody else, Alex?
Yeah, Dick.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something in response to Chip and his concern about it's long enough ago now that I don't remember exactly how he said it. But I never say I don't believe in God. I say I don't believe in any gods. And the other thing is, when most people were discussing as far as who God is, with most of the people in our culture, we can almost assume that they're talking of the Christian God or the Judeo-Christian God.
I call it the God they believe in.
Well, yes, but
They use the one word, and each person in the room has a subtly different or vastly different God.
well, I guess I disagree with you on that. But
I think you're raising for me some questions like there's a book called God is Not One, which by Stephen Prothero, which kind of highlights both the sameness within these different traditions, but also pushes back against that nice liberal idea of, oh, all these gods, the Jewish God is the same as the Christian God, is the same as the Muslim God. It says, no, these gods are all quite different when we look down to the nuts and bolts of things.
I like to cut them off at, are you allowed to rape Yazidi women if you're a fighter?
Yeah, it's a good moral question. I would argue no.
That's a good line I used.
In the in that chapter, the atheism book, the atheism chapter in Stephen Prothero's book is not fantastic, but the other chapters like here are good representations. But Dick, you also raised a question to me, like when I first introduce myself to my students, and I say, usually it's in the interview, I say, I'm Ben, I'm a humanist chaplain. So you'd have to discern if whether or not God can talk to you through somebody who doesn't believe in God. And the way I kind of describe it is, I don't believe in God, but I believe in you. And that is how I define my work with my patients, with my students. And if you're okay with working with me when I believe in you, then we're good.
By individualizing them and their God as a unit, I can empathize more readily because I believe that they believe in what they believe.
And for me, the goal is not necessarily to change their mind from what they believe, but to ask how it impacts their life, how they live.
I think that's important. I never argue with people on this issue at all.
Right. When it's a chaplain, it's not like, oh, you believe in God, let me show you how you're wrong. It's like, you believe in God, tell me about how that's helping you out right now.
Yeah. But what I wanted to say, I understand where you're coming from as a teacher, but I'm talking about when you're talking with just ordinary people in ordinary conversation.
I say the same thing to the Joe on the street. When they say, tell me about humanism, my first response is, well, I don't believe in God, but I believe in you. And we can go from there. And that's usually, that steps back from an argument of God, because it's a positive declaration of what I believe in. And it's like, tell me about yourself then. Tell me about who I'm believing in and what you're doing. And that is a vastly different conversation than a Christian saying, oh, you don't believe in God? Let me show you how God exists. Like, that's a boring conversation. Hate those conversations. They're not going to convince me. I'm not going to convince them. But I can convince you that I can live an ethical life. I can convince you that I can love you and not believe in God. I can convince you that I can have empathy for my neighbor and help them shovel their cars out of the snow when I'm done with mine, even before I'm done with mine, that throws them for a whirlwind. When my conservative Christian dad was dying from cancer, he was dumbfounded that his little atheist kid was having a lot of compassion for him and was having all this patience for him. He often responded, "Man, Ben, you were so patient." Like, yeah, Dad, I believe in you. You taught me to be patient, so here I am.
Tom, I see your hand up.
The thing that's interesting is I was raised as a Roman Catholic, and I went to Catholic high school and all that stuff. And then when I was in Vietnam, a Catholic priest told me to kill a commie for Christ. That was the end of it. But at that point, I started thinking, what did I really believe? And so my thinking about, is there a God? Well, is there a God? Well, that's an interesting academic question, but it has nothing to do with the way I run my life.
And that's that very point is a part of why I identify as humanist more than atheist. Am I an atheist? Yes. I don't believe in God, but really when it comes down to how I live my life or how I try to live my life, it's a humanist. You know, there is again, I think I actually do as much as I can to not use the language of negation. Non-theist, non-religious, atheist. I think it's again, it gives too much power to the religious, to the theist, because in order for me to define myself as an atheist, I need a theist. I need theism in order to be atheism. I need religious in order to be non-religious. If theism were to be removed, happy day, but then who am I if I'm an atheist? And I think, again, it is a more powerful statement to say I'm a humanist. It's saying to the theist, I don't need you. It's saying to theism, I don't need you. I'm a humanist. And I think there's actually more power and more assertion, more challenge actually in that than saying I'm an atheist. But I'll get off that soapbox.
I see your hand up.
So I wanted to comment on your discussion of the golden rule versus platinum rule.
Yeah.
And I think that was kind of eye-opening for me. I'd never looked at it in quite those terms. I think that not necessarily striving for equal wealth among everybody, but equal opportunity for everybody, certainly. And doing the most good for the most people is valid, but you have to kind of balance, do I want to give away everything I have to the poor and then be done giving? Or do I want to maintain some of my wealth so that I can continue to do things for others?
Yeah, that's complex ethical conversation. Sorry, Ray, keep going.
So I think that the way I look at it is I want to look at what I can do that will benefit the most people. And so I support nuclear energy because energy poverty is a worldwide problem. And I think that, you know, getting back to what Chip said about his God is between his ears, the problem is that when that same God gets between too many ears, they can try and reduce the freedoms of the rest of us to do what's right.
Which in their mind is right.
I think, Ray, you point to some of the complications of the calculus of the ethics there, right? And how does one achieve the greatest good for the greatest amount of people? I think in some ways that is honestly a bit of my critique of kind of bald utilitarianism. Like the calculus is so freaking complex. How do you figure that out? But yeah, I think I forget. There's a my mind is blanking what I was gonna say in response to the. Oh yes, there is some tension in that idea of maintaining the wealth, my own wealth, so that I can continue to help more and more people. I think there's validity in that. Just kind of speaking off the cuff, the tension I have is it raises in my mind some of the tension I have with the poverty industry, where if homeless shelters were really about ending homelessness, they would be putting themselves out of business. And I don't see many homeless shelters going about that process. You know, they, in some ways, they are a part of the system that continues the homelessness cycle by a variety of means. But, you know, their goal is not really to end poverty or to end homelessness, because then they would be out of a job. In some ways, I live into that own tension. I don't want to give away all that money, because then I won't have any money of my own and I won't be able to continue that process. I think there is some tension for me in that space of things. It doesn't negate the good that I want to do or that I do in the long term, but also recognizing that, from my perspective anyways, for me, there is a bit of my own selfishness involved that keeps me a little more comfortable than I really could be. I could survive off of less than what I have, but I'm also not terribly willing to give up a whole lot of what I have. That, you know, there's some tension in there. How much privilege am I willing to sacrifice? And that provides me with some guilt, quite frankly.
Dana, Jerry.
Yeah, there are some humanists who think that sentientism is a step up from humanism. I was wondering what you thought of that.
What are you defining as Ascensionism?
Well, I'm not an expert on it, but the basic idea is it's more than just humans. You know, we care about humans and animals and you know, life.
Good. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure we were talking about the same thing. Yeah.
Okay.
I think there is value in that way of thinking. I think there is, I have tension with the speciesism, that's kind of what I think of it as, of humanism. I am a vegetarian, in part because I don't want to take the lives of other creatures. If my life as an evolved creature is valuable, certainly the lives of other creatures are also valuable. Nevertheless, one must eat. We have evolved to gain nutrients in certain ways. We can't deny that aspect of things. Certain research in plants may suggest that there's a certain sentientism to plants that we just have not recognized from our own speciesism. You know, a central nervous system one must have in order to be sentient. There are certain studies in plants that imply they actually might be able to hear without having an ear. They might actually be able to talk to each other and sacrifice their well-being for the lives of other trees. It's really kind of fascinating. Then the complicated question comes, at what point do you draw the line on your speciesism? At some point, there is a valid argument, I think, to saying we have evolved to eat a complex herbivore, like omnivore diet, and to not live into that is to deny that piece of things. We can do it more humanely. Certainly, we don't need a meat complex that treats animals as commodities rather than living creatures. But I'll get off that high horse. But yeah, I think there is some validity in my mind to the question of sentientism, as you're putting it. I think of it as speciesism. There is a certain level of arrogance to saying that I am human and thus I can dominate everything. I'm the highest point of evolution. At the most honest response to that is that humanity is the highest point of evolution for now.
Well, did you really mean that? I mean, we tend to dominate right now, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're the highest point.
I went to seminary. I was raised in conservative Christianity. Honestly, my scientific literalism, my ability to understand science, I was not raised in that realm of things. It's second learned. But my understanding of things is from, as we look at sort of the DNA and we understand evolution, we can kind of point to humanity as being the current product, maybe along with everything else that we see living, as sort of the latest round of evolutionary progress. But that again might be my own speciesism and imperialism coming out. I'm willing to take it with a grain of salt.
Well, also, you know, I mean, different people draw the evolutionary tree in different ways, and some people put humans at the top. But I've also seen this diagram where you start at the center and then you go outward, so that everything that exists right now is on the fringe. And you know, we're just one small branch of all that.
Yeah, that tree is quite appealing to me. I'll have to find that out. Can you maybe direct me somewhere, that resource somewhere?
I'm sorry, I don't.
Any modern biology book.
Oh yeah. Oh, okay. All right.
I want to.
Thanks very much for your comments.
Thanks, Jerry.
I inadvertently deleted or lowered someone's hand. I didn't mean to. So if your hand was up and you haven't been called on, raise it again.
It's kind of making us.
Or if not, oh, there we go. Zem.
Yeah, the remark you made about homeless shelters, I think it's right on. I heard somewhere that the city of San Francisco spends $53,000 a year for each homeless person. So it's sort of, you know, the fear of going out of business at a, you know, grander scale. However, my question was about what relationship you see, if any, between secular humanism and libertarianism.
Yeah, I think anecdotally, my experience of humanists are that they are either the far left liberals or they are libertarianism. I think both sides, I think, can be legitimate expressions of humanism. Clearly I lean towards the far left liberalism over the libertarian side of things. My own personal critique of the libertarian, you know, if our goal is the greatest freedom, you know, for everybody, there is an even playing field, I think, that libertarianism assumes that I don't think is the reality. I think that's what pushes me to a more liberal understanding of the world than the libertarian, but I don't think that they are exclusive of each other. You know, to stir the pot a little bit, I did make one day, I just for the hell of it, I made a atheistic argument against abortion. I could do that. Do I agree with it? No. But I think you could make a valid argument from a secular perspective against abortion.
No, Jerry.
Dana.
You had your hand up.
Yeah, I felt I should chime in with something
Yeah.
that I'm thinking about earlier. You were talking about where do our ethics and morals and so on come from. And I thought, well, heck, we all know where they come from. They come from your mom and your dad saying, okay, don't hit your sister. okay, can't you share? Okay, can't you get along and give us a little peace and quiet? So it's the result of like a personal desire of these parents to have a little peace and quiet and not noise, turmoil, and bashing and destruction going on. That kind of gives rise to these ideas that getting along and being empathetic to others is very functional. And I really think that's where most people's ideas of God come from. In a way that if mom and dad aren't around, they think there is some entity in the space above us that is in favor of empathy, doing good, and having things peaceful. And that's the only way things flourish and grow. Otherwise, everything is destroyed. So, yeah. So it's a kind of down to earth argument about where these kind of ideas originate.
So maybe God is mom and dad.
Well, in the beginning, they are.
I mean, you're definitely getting into like you know, psychology of religion, God as a father figure, etc. Often how we view God is how our society views being a good parent, and you can see how that has changed over time. I don't disagree with you. Like, in some ways, yeah, my morality was taught very much by my mom and my dad. I think we can also point to a sort of, from my understanding of things, a social evolution that might point to, again, as we evolve to be social creatures, those things of sharing and empathy kind of pointed to some sort of, I understand there was some controversy in this, you know, of the evolutionary progress of our species. And there are ways people are researching that side of things. But I do think it is worthwhile to ground our ethics something beyond our mom and dad. And I think there is a definite possibility for people to change their ethical foundation away from what their mom and dad taught them. And then the question is, what are we using to create that foundation if we do that?
I have a small quote of what you said. You talked about God as a father figure. We had a forum many years ago where somebody argued that, you know, patriarchy is a relatively new invention, that it used to be the world was matriarchal instead of patriarchal, and basically in those days God was a mother figure. Yeah.
Quibble taken. I will own my sexism in that language of things. It is a habit I am trying to unlearn, sometimes better than others. Thank you.
Anna's comment brought to mind everything I need to know I learned in kindergarten.
Robert Fulgham, a good Unitarian Universalist pastor right there.
If you've ever seen the movie Dogma, you know, it's pretty religious, and although it's not exactly approval, Kevin Smith is an unusual fellow. In Dogma, God is a woman.
Yeah, I mean, if we look to the Hebrew Bible, I mean, we're sticking in the Judeo-Christian realm of things. We're ignoring the Hindu representations of the divine, et cetera, et cetera. The Hebrew language in Genesis actually implies that the divine is in fact both male and female at the same time, and created the first human being in God's image, that Adam being both male and female at the same time. And God then splits that person in half to make the male and female parts. But the initial image of God in that Hebrew language, when it says that God made humanity in God's image, God made them male and female at the same time. Thus, according to the rabbis, implying that God was somewhat of both male and female.
None of the ribs.
Excuse me, we had a speaker sometime back, and someone brought up in the audience that it sounded like we were saying that humanism is the basis of all religion. And I think that might be correct in that if you're establishing a moral system, and you might want to do that, you would start with, basically you would start with humanism, and everything else is ritual and tradition, and it was, these religions formed in an area where most people believed in disembodied spirits and ghosts and such, so they kind of carried over.
Yeah.
Another comment I had heard from someone, it was about going to extremes, and someone made a comment that he didn't appreciate utilitarianism because it inevitably implied that some lives were more important than others.
That's a part of my critique of utilitarianism. There's eventually a loser, and we expect them to have some sort of stoic acceptance of this loss.
There's some myth about some idyllic city with some child being tortured somewhere to ensure that everything. Actually, The Last Unicorn, good book. There was a castle, and the witch who built it didn't get paid, and she asked the local town to help, and they refused. So she put a curse on the town, and the curse was that their wealth would increase indefinitely until some child from the town brought about something that would bring it all crashing down. And the reaction was not to have any children.
Yeah. The humanism as the foundation for all religions, the argument I make is that the reason there are humane values in all of these other religious traditions is actually because there is this socially evolved need for these values in humanity, and they get themselves manifested in these various religious structures that we've pointed to. In some ways, humanism has effectively, or works to deconstruct all of the other religious trappings to it, to say, here are the humane values by which we live. If the humane values, I would argue, are inherent to our humanity, and human beings are going around creating religious structures, inevitably, whether they like it or not, those humane values are kind of pop up. And that's kind of why I kind of argue you may find some humane values in every tradition.
Dick, your hand's been up for a while.
Yeah, I'm going back to, I'm happy that Dana brought up the idea of mother, and I wanted, I have a personal anecdote I want to tell you, but before that, this whole thing about the patriarchy, we refer to Mother Nature and Mother Earth, and I really like those terms myself. But the anecdote I wanted to tell is when I was a small child and went to Sunday school, the Sunday school teacher told us that our Heavenly Father loves us just like our earthly father. And that was very difficult for me because I had an earthly father that I didn't think loved me.
Yeah, that's that analogy falls apart when you have a pretty hateful son of a bitch father.
Yeah.
Before we get, I see Marion's hand has been raised a while. Can we get you? Yeah.
Thank you. But Dick didn't, that was the anecdote, I guess. You finished.
Yes, I did. Yes.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Marion.
No, I keep raising it because I cannot figure anymore. I don't see the raised hand icon at all. I used to. So I'd like to discuss that maybe with Alex later or something. But anyway, I'm on participants, and all I see below is invite and mute me. Okay. Anyway, I wanted to address, I think it was Chip, or actually it was you that brought up this idea of libertarian branch of humanism. My idea of libertarianism is that it's almost sort of the opposite of humanism, and I don't understand how it could be seen as a part, because I think the fundamental thing about libertarianism to me is that every person needs to be strong in themselves, And this is why, the Ayn Rand books, I think, are a big hit. So I don't really see where a libertarian, and politically, it seems to be, I guess it might be people that are on the left, progressive lefts, but, and it makes sense not to put down probably everybody in this whole group practically, but a huge component of the people who believe in libertarianism have jobs related to the tech industry. And therefore they're making very good salaries, and they're overwhelmingly Caucasian and overwhelmingly male. So I just don't see libertarianism as, so it makes sense, that people with that background, even who can, and who are very liberal generally in a lot of their thoughts, would still have this kind of component to their personalities. And I really don't like libertarianism, in case you didn't pick that up.
I think I've laid my far left liberal cards on the table. So
Far left's okay.
Yeah.
But that is not far left. I mean, that's far right, if anything.
And that way I'm sort of joining you in my suspicion of libertarianism, and I apologize to my libertarian humanist friends. But I do think that there is, you can make a solid case for libertarianism from a humanist foundation. If your goal is the maximum amount of freedom, and you see government as restricting certain freedoms upon everybody, and you see libertarianism as small government, as the removal of all of those constrictions of freedoms, I think that and in particular, if you have a more positivistic view of humanity, that humans are basically good, and maybe all these other things get in our way, if we remove all those things that are getting in our way, perhaps you might have a libertarian in your midst.
Okay, well, one of the groups also that is very, very, very much for freedom is the gun lobby, right? I mean, we could kill a few more people if we get that going a little bit more.
Sure.
We're already there, actually. So I just don't. What is supposed to be just the emphasis on freedom? I mean, everybody wants freedom, pretty much, I think, when you get down to it.
Yeah, I think I would be a bad representation of libertarianism. And maybe if we have a libertarianist who's willing to step into that space now, great. If we want to sidestep the whole conversation, I'm good with that too.
Ray.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Okay, I've got a couple points. One, you're talking about matriarchal society, patriarchal society. And when I was growing up, male and female seemed to be pretty well defined. And now there's a lot of gender identity that seems to be in question. And so I'm wondering, what that might eventually lead to. The other thing I wanted to mention was, let's see, what was it? Well, I'll get back to that one.
I honestly, I love gender ambiguity, quite frankly. When we look at the biology of sex, my biology was taught you have an XY chromosome or an XX chromosome, and that determines if you're male or female. Human biology is actually much more complex than that, in all sorts of different ways. And I think when we're talking about gender expression, we can't deny the cultural impact that goes into the gender expression of things. If we are, again, valuing each human being regardless of their gender identity, the complex biological functions of what goes into determining what we might identify as a male or a female, each person has value. whether they are male or female or in between or something else entirely. And who am I to push my own needs of a binary onto somebody? It's kind of how I approach it. I'm not saying that you're arguing for a binary, but that's just my take on it.
I remember the other thing I wanted to mention on, and that is concerning evolution. You had made the point that evolution has been unguided by a supreme being or anything else. And I think that we may be approaching the point in our human evolution where evolution will become guided, and it will become guided by humans using our technology.
I think that is a valid, and I think I heard Dana gasping. I can join her in that gasping, but I do think that is a valid question and a concern of my own. But yeah.
Let me say something, if I may.
Sure, Lester.
Yes, this whole discussion, unfortunately, is about nonsense. Your brains are all malfunctioning, and we inherited that from our hunter-gatherer ancestors, I claim. In the beginning, there were no gods. And then chimpanzees spun off a bunch of tribal groups that were on their own and evolved in various directions. And one of them eventually started evolving much faster than the others. And they eventually developed a speech capability, which was a major change because that enabled them, among other things, to coordinate attacks on others by yelling. And they then succeeded in killing off all other tribes, becoming dominant, and we are their descendants. But one of the problems that emerged is the use of speech, first of all, enabled the creation of gods, hundreds of them. And they started out by creating one god to explain each mystery of the universe. That's why there were so many of them.
I don't disagree with the idea that humanity created religion. I'm sorry, Lester, were you not finished? Sorry.
What?
Sorry, I thought I heard you saying something.
Well,
further.
I was just going to say that in addition to that part of the evolution, they adopted, well, in choosing between alternatives, you have to somehow rank them. And they adopted the idea that all alternatives could be ranked on a linear scale, which happens to be scientific nonsense. But it got embedded in their brains, and their DNA, which has been handed off to us. Therefore, we think linearly about almost everything. For example, there is this pretense that political positions lie somewhere on a line between left and right, or progressive and conservative, or whatever you want to call it. That is pure nonsense, because political positions are multidimensional, not linear. But it's embedded in our brains, and therefore these conversations that we have often refer to the left and the right in various terms. But the real choices are more complex than that. So we're thinking erroneously and discussing erroneously. And this has been going on for about 10 million years.
Well, I'm in good company then. Well, then I'm in good company then.
Yeah. Well, anyway.
I mean, you've done a very good summary of Michel Foucault's Archaeology of Knowledge, which is a wonderful book. And I do take your point that life is complicated, decisions are complicated. I have tension between distinguishing between something that is limited yet useful, say the conversation of left versus right politics, and it being erroneous. Simplistic, sure. Useful, I would argue as well. Actually matching reality, as you pointed out, not really, because reality is much more complex, is kind of how I would look at it. That is my own sort of internal tension with that space. But as you say, we have been doing this for hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of years, and I'm glad to be in good company with my ancestors.
Senna, you had something you wanted to say.
Yeah, I was going to say something like Lester was saying, you know, as things happen, people figured out, the people who descended from monkeys specifically and won out over everybody else began to figure out, well, what does that mean? Why is that happening, etc. And they came up with a god or whatever to explain it. But I was sort of amused by what he said about yelling at everybody, howler monkeys.
Senna, you had the floor.
Yes. I want to say something else about the ethics really quickly, and that is that when I was a teenager, my mother told me that she and my father had told us, this is, by example and some lessons, spoken things, this is how we do what we do, why we do it, and all that. And I had a great aunt, my mother's aunt, who told her that she and my father should take us to church. But I negated that.
You want to say something? You won't see me because of the picture. You can't turn off the picture? No.
My mother negated that, and she told me later that my aunt decided that our family was one of the most moral, without actually saying Christian families she ever knew, who weren't insisting on going to church.
And they don't think there's nobody here. Anyway, Senna, you have something to say.
Yes, I thought it was strange that one could say that nothing was directing evolution. I think nature's doing a pretty good job of that, and you can see all around you evidence of how it's been directed. And I guess we could think of today's situation as also responding to the environment and so forth. It doesn't look good.
Yeah, Fair enough. We're going to have to agree to disagree on that stage of things. I see it seems clear to me, say, in things such as the appendix or other sort of vestigial anomalies in our lives, DNA that is no longer needed or extraneous, that it's not necessarily designed by anything, and that really happenstance, and if anything directs it, it is happenstance and need, from my perspective. Yeah, I mean, filling in the gaps of life's need. When there's a gap, that life tends to figure out some way to fill it in by some way.
Okay, Dana, Jerry.
You calling on me?
Yes, I am. Your hand was up. And you're frozen.
Yeah.
We'll get back to you. Zem. I see your hand up.
Yeah.
Hello?
I sometimes hear religion as being described the quest to find meaning in a meaningless world. And I was wondering if humanism also meets that definition.
I would argue yes. I think that creates some tension with the sort of anti-religious branches of humanism. I'm okay with that. I have another talk kind of related to this called Spiritually Secular, where, it's sort of this idea of, yes, humanism is the sort of secular religious expression of trying to create meaning from a meaningless world. It is, to Lester's comments of the evolutionary needs of human beings, I think it is a part of what we have evolved into, this need. It's partly why I think humanism needs to be more assertive in what it's offering folks. Because if we don't fill that need, something, in my opinion, much more harmful will. So we might as well grab it by the horns and fill that space up.
Thanks.
Okay, Jerry, I see you're back.
Yeah. First of all, about Les's point about multidimensionality of politics, I'm a little annoyed that he brought that up, because I plan to bring that up. I quite agree that there are multiple dimensions, and that the single dimensional spectrum that we have right now is a gross oversimplification. As an example, I'm a Green Party member, and which is usually considered far left. Libertarians are considered far right, but there are certain areas that I agree with libertarians and I don't agree with Democrats and Republicans. The other thing is about libertarianism. I have read two of Ayn Rand's books, Atlas Shrugged and Fountainhead, and they're both very appealing. I like what she says. On the other hand, there are libertarians who think things that I don't like. Libertarians are more likely to be climate deniers. So, this raises a complex issue for me. And as near as I can tell, as far as I've gotten at the moment is that basically libertarianism is fine in an ideal world, but we don't live in an ideal world. I'm done.
I thought your hand was up there for a minute, Ben.
No, I was waving goodbye to Helen as she was leaving.
Oh, okay. I have trouble with I haven't quite figured out what the distinction is between between the word to believe, between believing something and believing in something. It seems like believing in something means you're relying on it to guide you.
Yeah, I don't know that I've created a good distinction for myself either, Alex, quite honestly. I think believing in something implies trust. And like, so when I say I don't believe in God, but I believe in you, I am saying both that I do not believe in the supernatural, nor do I, if that supernatural were to exist, would I particularly trust it. But I do believe that my fellow human being exists, and I'm inclined to trust them until they prove me otherwise. That is how I'm making those distinctions, I guess, if that's kind of what you're pointing to. Yeah.
So with a kind of a commitment to, when you believe in something, it seems like kind of a commitment to it.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, that's the way I experience it, at least as when I'm talking about it with my fellow human being, in particular, like when I'm talking to my students, it is a commitment to them and their well-being and their growth as chaplains. In my experience, that is often a disorienting process for them, not only because I am a humanist, but because I often believe in them more than they believe in themselves, as far as that trust and their ability to do something. And that can be a good learning process for them in that skill development piece, but also just in like everyday living. I believe that humanity is ethically ambiguous. We're not good nor bad. We just kind of are. But I still put a decent amount of trust in them. I mean, I hope we will figure this shit out.
There's also a distinction, I think, between being right and being wrong. If we look at something like, is the Earth the center of the universe, or is the sun the center of the universe? You know, a quick they're just models of how the world works. And someone came along and said the math in saying that the Earth is the center of the universe makes everything kind of complicated. It's simpler to say the sun is the center. The orbits don't get as weird. And we kind of followed that path, but it's not that the others were wrong. They just didn't look at the things that others are looking at. So we have a more inclusive model now.
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
And you know, in our present model of subatomic particles and fields and virtual particles is useful.
Yeah, if only I could understand it, I'd be.
Yeah. How can you make an atomic bomb without this, right? But yeah, I mean, the whole question of right and wrong is really a question of what's the better model.
Yeah.
And
utility, I think, comes into the question there too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I really try to avoid moralizing language as far as right or wrong or better or worse. I try to live into distinction and celebration of differences, even in the my staunch belief that there is no supernatural. I could be wrong. Maybe science will someday prove me wrong. But I would say science might prove that assumption to be not accurate to the reality of things rather than wrong or right, you know?
My problem with saying that something is magic is that it doesn't lead to anything, you know? Talk about how your car engine works. If you say it's magic, that's it. There's nothing more to say about it.
Yeah.
If you give more details, you might be able to figure out why it's not working.
Yeah. I think historically, the cry of magic, I would painting with a broad brush. Theism runs into mystery, and that's kind of the end of the road. I think, as I kind of pointed to earlier, the scientific process of things, I think the more secular tradition of things runs into mystery and sees that as a challenge. Figure out what's next.
I want
Arthur-
to make a
Arthur
comment
said-
on what you just said about maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong. At the FFRF convention, Sasha Sagan, the daughter of Carl Sagan, told a story which I thought was wonderful because she was there with her mother, Andrian. And she said when she was a little girl, someone was saying that somebody went to heaven, and she asked her parents. She said because she knew they didn't think people went, and she said, where do we go after we die? And Carl Sagan said, no one knows. And I thought that was a marvelous response.